Thank you so much for the introduction. It really is an honor to be among such an amazing group of young scientists. So thank you so much for this opportunity. So the title of my talk, Simple Materials Reimagined, highlights one of the themes of my presentation, but also something that I think is really important in science that we don't discuss quite enough, which is the role that imagination plays in scientific research and innovation. I personally think that there's so much to be learned and discovered just by looking at simple, everyday materials around us if we're willing to reimagine their purpose and their function. So I'm really excited to share with you an example of that from our own research today. Before I get to that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my journey in chemistry. And I kept wanting to start this story with dolphins, which seems a little bit strange, but when I was a kid, I was totally obsessed with dolphins. So this is a picture of me with my sister. I'm the one with the heart-shaped glasses looking at this dolphin. And if you knew me back then, you would have thought that I'd become a marine biologist. And clearly, I'm not a marine biologist. That's OK. But I do largely credit my love of dolphins, all things oceanography, and my parents' encouragement of me to learn everything that I could about it. That really was the start of my love of science. Chemistry specifically didn't really come into the picture until high school. I was really fortunate to go to a science and tech high school with amazing teachers and resources, and I took 3 years of chemistry classes. So by the time I went off to college, I couldn't imagine a semester without chemistry. That coupled with my undergraduate research experiences, and I was well on my way to my current career path. That being said, there have been so many people along the way that have helped me. Friends, family, mentors, colleagues, role models, advisors. Without all of them, and of course there are too many to list or to picture here, but without their help, I certainly wouldn't be where I am today. Something else that I think has really helped me in my scientific career, which I probably wouldn't have given credit to until more recently, was actually my childhood endeavors in creative problem-solving competitions, such as Destination Imagination, Future Problem Solvers, Odyssey of the Mind. And if you're not familiar with those programs, they're just team-based creative problem-solving competitions where you solve open-ended problems on a shoestring budget, really short timelines, which I just did because I had fun, I was with my friends, I got to build things, which was great. In retrospect, of course, what I was doing, I was practicing my creative thinking abilities, and I was honing my imagination, which I think has helped me tremendously as a scientist in my current career. And so it was really training me to look at things around me, everyday things, and see them perhaps differently. So maybe a silly example, right? If you gave me a red Solo cup, maybe I wouldn't see it as a cup. Maybe I would see it as like the head of this marionette puppet that we built, which is maybe a silly example, but as scientists, this is really what we do every day, right? We have to look at data, we have to look at materials and phenomena around us, and we have to see things in these materials that we've never seen before, that nobody else has seen before. And we do that by using our mind's eye, by using our imagination. So imagination and creativity are incredibly important in science. I don't think people would argue with that, but I think what we should discuss more is, as a field, what role we want creativity training to play in a formal STEM education, because creative thinking and imagination, I think, are really things that we need to practice in order to get better, and it is so important in scientific research. So now to sort of transition to the research part of the talk, of course, I have to acknowledge and thank my amazing research group and colleagues at Penn State. Without them, of course, none of the work that I'm about to show you would be possible. So I'm really fortunate to be able to work with such an amazing group of people. My research group primarily focuses on design, synthesis, and integration of materials for adaptive microscale systems. And we do this really through 2 different materials platforms. First would be soft materials, a lot of liquids and gels, looking at how these reconfigurable materials change their shape, change their interfaces, how can we use that to create adaptive active materials. And the second part of my research group largely focuses on using laser direct writing and synthesis to pattern and integrate materials on micrometer length scales to create more complex functional architectures. Now, because this talk is relatively short, I don't have a lot of time to go into detail of all of this, so I've just chosen one story to tell you today related to the reconfigurable fluids and adaptive materials part of our research. So I'm going to begin on the next slide with a video of something that I think many of you may have already seen before in your daily lives, right? So we begin with a Petri dish, and we're going to pour warm water in it, and then put the lid onto this dish, and we see these pretty colors appear. Now, certainly if you work with Petri dishes in your lab, almost certainly you've seen something like this. You may have also seen this effect when you put saran wrap over warm food, for instance, or on the inside of a water bottle. And if you see this, you go, oh, that's really pretty. But maybe it looks like things I've seen before. Maybe it's diffraction or thin film interference. And it's very easy to just brush this off as something commonplace that you see every day that there's not much to be learned from. But if you were to look at this material in a different way, for instance, look at it under a microscope. If you look at the lid of this Petri dish under a microscope, you would see this. So the color is actually coming from a ring around each droplet near the three-phase contact line. The color appears to be size dependent. And these droplets are also very large. They're tens of microns. So all of these features that we see are incompatible with diffraction, thin film interference, things that we would normally associate with having nanoscale periodicity. So we were really interested in this and trying to figure out what was causing these really cool colors in such a very simple system. So we worked together with some collaborators at MIT to try to figure out what exactly was going on here. So the exact material geometry that we're working with here, of course, is a water droplet on a fairly hydrophobic substrate, so it has a decently high contact angle, which makes a concave surface here between a high refractive index water and the low refractive index air. Now, anytime you go from high refractive index to low refractive index, of course, something that can happen is total internal reflection. So at or above a certain critical angle, all of the light can actually be completely reflected off of this interface from high to low refractive index, kind of like a mirror. So what you could imagine is that light actually bounces around on the inside of this surface, much like how a retroreflector would work. So that could explain how light gets reflected from these droplets, but it doesn't explain the color. Right? So where does the color come from? Of course, I'm going to tell you, and when I tell you, it's going to sound fairly perhaps intuitive or straightforward, but keep in mind that hindsight is always 20/20, right? So we have this high to low refractive index microscale curvature. Now, depending on where the light enters this cavity, it might bounce 2 times, right? It might bounce 3 times. Maybe it bounces 4 times, right? There are so many different trajectories that the light could take along this interface, just depending on the angle it's coming in at and where it hits along that interface. All of these trajectories are happening at the same time. Okay? So if we put all of these together in one picture, what we realize is that the light that's bounced 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, it has a different path length. It has a different phase. And so it can actually interfere with the light that's taken a different trajectory. So this is an interference mechanism, but it's an interference mechanism that doesn't have the sort of nanoscale periodicity that you would normally associate with structural coloration and interference colors. So now that we know that, we can think about harnessing this effect in materials like droplets that you would not normally think about. And a really nice example of this would be, in addition to, obviously, the refractive index is important, but the geometry is really important too. So a really nice demonstration, just take that Petri dish. So this entire thing is a Petri dish. And the black regions have been treated to be more hydrophilic. So there's water everywhere. So there's water here, but it doesn't have any color because the contact angle is too low to reflect the light. And everywhere where it's hydrophobic, and you see these colors, you do have this geometry of the water that can support that total internal reflection interference. And so we can diversify the materials that we can use. Now that we can harness this effect in a microscale geometry, we can access it in situations we would not normally think about. For instance, in biphasic liquid droplets. So this is a oil and oil droplet, and by tuning this interface, we can have materials, for instance, that have photopatternable color or dynamic color by reconfiguring the curvature of these interfaces. We can also do it in solids, so we can make mechanoresponsive materials, we can make particles and films. And we're really excited about the possibilities of what we can do with this effect now that we understand what's causing it and how to harness it on the micro scale. So of course, all of this was really possible by just looking at a very simple material, but in a new light, pun intended. So you might see this now on the inside of a water bottle on a hot day when you have condensation. For instance, or on the inside of a Tupperware container, you might see these colors, and now you'll know what's causing them. So I want to end with a question that a friend of mine asked me not too long ago, which I really liked, which was, what exists today that could not have existed 500 years ago? And the answer is, of course, nothing. Because we have the exact same elements, we have the same laws of physics today as we did 500 years ago. And I find this really empowering, because what it means is that whatever is going to exist 500 years from now, it could exist today. We have all the right building blocks. We just have to figure out how to creatively put them together in new and innovative ways, right? And sometimes that just involves looking at those materials from a new perspective, right? So what I think is really limiting us is our imagination and our ability to just look at the materials around us and be open to inspiration from even the simplest things, such as water droplets. So thank you very much for your attention.